Disclaimer, this video is about to get real tragic, so if you're not in the headspace to deal with child harm or, decapitation, stuff like that, I'd just catch me on the next one. For the life of me, I don't understand how people like this exist. I know there's a good few centuries separating us from their crimes, but some of the things these men did were absolutely repulsive, and all for basically no reason. Two bloodthirsty sadists, cousins, go down in infamy as America's first documented serial killers. Long before the term serial killer would be officially coined by FBI agent and profile Robert Ressler in 1974, the Harpe Brothers were terrorizing loyalists, patriots, and indigenous peoples alike in the latter part of the 1700s. But who were these men and how did they obtain such a dubious distinction? We'll find out more today. But first, welcome to Creepycasettiyt, your place for horror in reality and beyond. I'm your host Dee, and if this sort of content is fascinating to you, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification bell so you'll know every time I drop another video. And maybe share, because all of these actions really help the channel. Plus, if you subscribe, we can be besties. You can come back and join me for our bi-weekly chats. Now back to the video. Early life. Micajah, Big Harpe, and Wiley, Little Harpe, were the children of two Scottish brothers. So while history knows them to be the Harpe brothers, they are actually cousins. It's not clear why the two started going by Micajah and Wiley, being that they were born Joshua and William Harper, respectively. However, the nicknames of Big and Little Harpe were given because Micajah was bony and muscular and towered over Wiley. Much like the cliche supervillain duo, Micajah was the brawn while Wiley was the brains. We know that the last name change was their parents' way of currying favor with their patriot neighbors, as the last name Harper was a common surname for loyalists at the time, and the men's fathers were loyalists, and that would ultimately become their demise. Due to the unclear birth records, because it's the 1700s and because some reports state that they were actually born in Scotland and immigrated to Orange County, North Carolina with their parents, their dates of birth are unclear, but some historians place Micajah's year of birth as 1748 and Wiley's as 1750, and these were the years that I saw most while doing research for this video. They grew up together and were so close that the locals started calling them the Harpe Brothers, and the name must have stuck because we're still calling them that today. There's not much more info available on their childhood. What we do know is that at some point, as the American Revolution loomed over the lives of patriots and loyalists, the two watched from afar as their parents were executed for their loyalist sentiments. This left the boys orphaned and bitter. At some point in 1775, the two men left North Carolina for Virginia to get jobs as slave overseers. While they did that job for a couple of years, they were eventually swept up into the politics of war. They attempted to join the war on the Patriot side and were coolly rebuffed, with some records stating part of their reason for their rejection was some of the older soldiers remembered the involvement of their fathers on the side of the Loyalists. I think it's more likely they probably sensed the men's bloodlust and not a thirst for independence from the crowd. After being rejected, they joined up with an outcast group of loyalists that burned down farms, brutalized women, and pillaged patriot villages. It's no doubt that the men saw an opportunity to engage in their depravity. The posse they joined was responsible for the kidnapping and rape of 3 teenage girls. A 4th girl was almost defiled by Wiley. Thankfully, she was saved by Captain James Wood of the U.S. Continental Army. He shot and wounded Wiley. Unfortunately, the wounding was not enough to end the little Harpe, and he and Micajah were able to continue their sadistic rampage. Only this time, Wiley had a grudge and an intent to settle it. In 1780, they left the Loyalist posse to join the regular British troops, fighting in several battles along the North and South Carolina borders. Their stint was fairly short-lived, as they left the troops in 1781 and joined an offshoot group of Chickamauga Cherokee people, and aided them in raiding and pillaging Patriot settlements in North Carolina and Tennessee. Here's where Wiley gets his revenge on Captain Woods. The Harpes managed to kidnap Susan Woods, the captain's daughter, and another woman by the name of Maria Davidson. The men took took the unwilling ladies to serve them by taking on wifely duties. The remaining group finally settled in Cherokee Chickamauga village of Micajah, located near what is modern-day Chattanooga. For 12 years, the couples lived in the little village. Maria and Susan became pregnant twice, each time the Harpes killed the babes. If that doesn't give you an idea of how truly evil these men were, I really don't know what else to say. But unfortunately, it only gets worse. In around 1795, the Harpes catch wind that the Patriots were planning to attack Micajah, and they fled with their wives and 4 other men to East Tennessee. Along the way, one of the men, Moses Doss, became one of the Harpes' victims, his supposed transgression being too concerned for the safety of the brutalized wives. They were offended by how much he cared for their women. Ideally, he would have taken them out first, but thanks for trying, Moses, you're a good egg. They eventually settled in Knox County, Tennessee, in a cabin alongside Beaver Creek near Holston River. They bred hogs for meat and for sale, and they were still up to their same thieving ways. The townspeople noticed their livestock missing, some pigs and horses. They also noticed that after some of the stock went missing, the Harpes had more wares for sale. They didn't stop at stealing livestock though. They also burned down some of the barns, which had to be really annoying because it wasn't like building an entire barn back then without power tools was an easy feat. In June 1797, Wiley married a local preacher's daughter by the name of Sarah Rice. Following his cousin's lead, Micajah took Susan Woods as his wife, and the men reportedly shared Maria, which just makes me feel terribly. The Harpes bit off more than they could chew with their livestock stealing when they stole some well-bred horses from Edward Teal. Teal and a few men around town formed a posse and actually managed to capture the Harpes. Unfortunately, as they were heading back to Knox County Jail, the men escaped. But once again, they were out for blood. They were going to find the man who gave away their location, and they believed a man by the name of Johnson divulged their location to the posse, so they pulled a man out of the Rowdy Groggery, owned by Mr. Hughes, and they killed him. Once he was dead, they opened him up, removed his innards, shoved rocks in his abdomen to make him less buoyant, and threw him in the Holston River. His body was eventually discovered drifting up the river a few days later. The men and their wives then fled to Kentucky. But, what's a road trip without a little murder? This time, the men robbed and murdered a peddler named Peyton. Still out for blood, the men ended up killing 2 more men who were traveling in the area at their campsite. The first one, Bates, died instantly. When the second man, Pacah, only staggered and did not fall, Micajah used his tomahawk to finish the job. They grabbed whatever items they found useful and set off again. Along the way, they stopped at the Ferris Inn, where a kindly gentleman named Stephen Langford offered to pay for food and accommodation. And as the old saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. The Harpes convinced Langford to travel with them, using strength in numbers as a good excuse, as traveling back then was a real crapshoot between the natural environment, animals in the area, and outlaws. A couple of days later, Langford's body was found by some area cattle herders. Not long after, another posse was formed to capture the group. The men and the 3 wives, who were all pregnant at this point, were captured and taken to Stanford Jail in Lincoln County, Kentucky. Then in January of 1799, the men managed to escape, leaving their heavily pregnant women to birth their children in jail. The wives were eventually tried and released. And that's gotta be a real big hell no for me. It's terrible enough that they had basically been using the women for years, but now they are leaving them in jail to give birth. Wow, these dudes really, really sucked. And I'm just glad this was a long ass time ago. When the women were released, the townspeople rallied to help them, giving them money, a few other items, and a horse to help them get to Knoxville. But instead of going to Knoxville, the women headed for a prearranged meeting place in Greenville to meet the Harpes. Here was their opportunity to escape, and for the life of me, I don't understand what would compel these women to stick around after they had their opportunity. I'd be damned. 2 theories surrounding the women's return to this disgraceful husbands are that they were suffering from Stockholm Syndrome before there was a term for that, and the other theory was that the Harpes, who were excellent huntsmen and trackers, would find them anyway and would more than likely relish being their undoing. I'd take my chances though. The men's killing spree really ramped up in 1799. In April of that year, the men left for Cave-in Rock, Illinois, which is where the river pirate Samuel Mason and his gang resided. The men were still being pursued by posses, one of which was working to persuade Colonel Daniel Taboo to join their manhunt. While the colonel was deciding on whether or not he wanted to be part of the manhunt, his 13-year-old son Johnny became another victim of the Harpes. They mercilessly beat the little boy and stabbed him to the point that he was left in almost pieces. Also, they could take flour and beans. Later that month, Kentucky Governor James Garrard issued a bounty for $300 per head for each of the Harpes. The message didn't reach the public until May. In May, the Harpes killed another man named Dooley in Kentucky. He was rowing his boat, equipped with a ton of fish and a fiddle, down the barren river. The Harpes stabbed him to death, and much like the death of the man named Johnson, they removed the contents of his abdomen, weighted him down with rocks, and then dropped the corpse in the river. The men fell in and out pretty quickly with the members of the Mason gang, but even they found the men's depravity to be too much. At one point, the group captured a flatboat. The Harpes pulled one of the captives off, lashed his naked body, and blindfolded him. They then blindfolded a horse and sent the creature sailing off the side of a 100-foot cliff, which no doubt ended in the death of both the horse and the captive. After this surprisingly blatant disregard for human life, the Mason gang didn't want anything else to do with the men, and they sent them packing. So back to Knoxville, Tennessee, they fled. In July 1799, as the men were closing in on their destination, they killed a farmer named Bradbury and followed that killing with the murder of a man named Hardin. They then took the life of a young boy on Black Oak Ridge to take his rifle. Following the young boy's murder, they murdered another man by the name of William Ballard, and just like they did with the other two men, pulled everything out, shoved the body full of stones, threw it in the river. On July 29th, they managed to talk brothers James and Robert Basil into joining a hunt for the Harpes. Once they led the unsuspecting brothers into the woods, they turned on the men, accusing them of being the Harpes. They ordered the men to dismount and hand over any weapons. One of the Harpes tied James Basil's hand, and Robert Basil dropped off of his horse, tried to grab James' gun. Not sure if he was successful. I'm guessing not, because he just ended up running off. He was chased by Wiley and managed to outrun him. When he had trekked about 10 miles, he caught the attention of a Mr. Dale and 4 other men who were traveling at the time. He led the men back to the site of the incident and found James badly beaten with a gash to his throat. The Harpes, of course, had already taken off. At the border of Tennessee and Kentucky, the Harpes murdered John Graves and his son. They then slaughtered all 10 members of the Chisward family, comprised of men, women, and children. They were stripped, their bodies mangled, and completely disfigured. In August 1799, one of the Harpes bashed the head of a young black child against a tree, killing him. They didn't take anything from the boys, so it seems like it was just another senseless act. What else is to be expected from these people? In that same month, they decapitated a little girl who had just been picking wild berries not far from home. But of course, they couldn't just leave it at that. No, they had to remove one of her legs and all of her little toes with it. And then we have another instance of Micajah Harpe killing his own offspring. In this case, his sick 9-month-old had been crying, which was more than Micajah could take. So he grabbed the poor baby by his ankles and slammed his head against a tree, crumbling his skull to pieces, and then threw the child's body off into the forest. The men disguised themselves as Methodist preachers and journeyed through Kentucky. They were invited to spend the night in the home of Moses Stegall, who the men may have met before. Moses was not there, but his wife Mary, like the good host she was, cooked the men a nice dinner and showed them where they could rest their heads for the night. There was another man named Major William Love staying in the Stegall's home that night. Micajah shared a room with the Major, and he must be really annoyed by snoring because he gave the man a tomahawk wound to the head. The next morning, Stegall's 4-month-old baby started crying, and this guy so Micajah the baby's throat. When Mary found her child, she screamed, and the Harpes killed her too. They burned down the cabin and went on about their day. Not far from the Stegall's cabin, they happened across the campsite of 2 men, Hudges and Gilmore. The men had just set up camp the evening before. On the next morning, the Harpes attacked the men, accusing them of the Stegall murder and arson. They shot and killed Gilmore. Hudgens broke free of the men momentarily before he too was killed. A well-deserved end. Moses Stegall returned to his home, destroyed, his wife and child dead, and he formed a posse. There weren't many people in the town and no nearby law enforcement, but the people had enough, and it was time for them to get those damned Harpes. They eventually found the Harpes' camp. Wiley escaped from the posse, and thankfully, Micajah was not so lucky. The group chased him into Muhlenberg County, Kentucky. He was shot by a man named Llers and finally detained. When Moses Stegall caught up, he slowly decapitated Micajah and then placed his head on a spike and put it on a tree. Good for him. Wiley went to Natchez, Mississippi for a little while and then headed back to Cave-in Rock, changing his name to John Seton. His hunger for money would ultimately be his undoing. Remember Samuel Mason gang from earlier? The group the Harpes were kicked out of? Well, Samuel Mason was also a notorious outlaw, and there was a $2,000 bounty on his head, which in today's money would be like $63,542.61, which is life-changing. Wiley thought, well, let's see if we can't get in on this bounty situation. So he and another criminal attacked the notorious river pirate, killed him, and removed his head. They preserved the head, turned it into the authorities to collect the bounty. However, someone recognized Wiley, and he was officially tried and executed by hanging in February of 1804. Why they let this monster have another 4 years of breathing, I have no idea, but I'm glad he finally got his just desserts. So, not long after Micajah's execution, the Harpe wives were tried, acquitted, and finally set free of the Harpes. 3 of the Harpe children managed to survive childhood with their hellish fathers, and I can only imagine how much safer the world felt for the people in the area with one less set of assholes to deal with. Conclusion. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to hear more about historical killers, and if so, do you have any suggestions for me? I hope this video wasn't too distressing, although I always feel terribly depressed when children are harmed, and unfortunately, there was a lot of that going on in this video, so I'm so sorry. I mean, obviously I feel terrible when adults are senselessly killed too, but kids, I can't. Anyway, I hope all is well in your world, and I hope to see you here again in 2 weeks for another video. Take care, all.